Good morning, everyone. I'm pleased to welcome you all to the 12th edition of the International Meeting of Studies on the Origins of Contemporary Philosophy, held at the Pontifical Catholic University of São Paulo. Due to the pandemic, this conference will be held online for the second time in a row. This fact forced us to resort to an approach that functions better under the circumstances, entailing a smaller number of lectures and debates. Every day of the week, there will be one non-Brazilian keynote speaker in the morning, followed by a debate with an invited Brazilian professor. This year, keynote speakers will be Maria van der Schaar, Universiteit Leiden, Lydia Payton, Virginia Tech, Delphine Antoine Mahout, École Normale Supérieure Lyon, Chiara Russo Kraus, Università di Napoli Federico II, and Caterina Kinzel, Universiteit Utrecht. The debaters will be Dirk Greimann, Universidade Federal Fluminense, Mauro Engelmann, Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, Federico Boccaccini, Universidade de Brasília, Ernesto Giusti, Unicentro, and Gabriel Ferreira, Unicinos. Before introducing our guest of the day, I would like to make an announcement. Our research group is happy to share the release of the first issue of our newly created journal, Geltung. The proposal of this new journal is, like the one of this meeting, to offer a space for historical philosophical studies of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century that contributes to a better understanding of the pairing of the ways of analytic and phenomenological hermeneutic philosophy. This inaugural issue featured contributions of Gottlieb Gabriel, Thomas Übel, Ingolf Marx, Chiara Kraus, and more. For anyone who would like to check it out, it will be linked in the chat. Today's opening lecture will be delivered by the esteemed Professor Maria van der Schaar. She is well known for her work on logic and the history of analytic philosophy. Professor Schaar's titles and achievements are too vast to be fully enumerated here, so I will sum them up by highlighting that she is currently one of the most influential philosophers in her areas of expertise. Professor Schaar's lecture will be followed by a debate with Dirk Greimann. I would like to thank both of them for their participation in this meeting. I would like to thank the President of the São Paulo City Council and the President of the School of its Parliament, Alexandro Santos, for their support. It was only by virtue of this support that it was possible to hold the meeting in its current format. Without further ado, I now invite Professor Schaar to speak. Professor Schaar, good morning.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much also for the invitation. And I will share my screen now. I think you can read the title now. Gottlob, Frege, Logic and the First Person. So this is a theme, logic and the first person, that is dear to my heart. And at this moment, I'm also looking at Tractatus and at Russell, but the work on Frege is not it's clearly not finished yet. So I'm very glad to have the opportunity to present some of my ideas. So in general, the idea is, the question is, what is the role of the judgment stroke in Frege's logic? And the talk will consist of 4 parts. The first part is based on a published paper, the judgment stroke and the first person. And then I will explain Frege's conception of logic. There is some kind of tension between the idea of a universalist conception in Frege, and the idea that the logical laws lie on a deeper level, and we'll look at that. Then it's very important to address Frege's logicism, how we can know arithmetical truths, how can we know the first principles of arithmetic, how are we to justify the logic, and this means how are we to justify the logical axioms and inference rules from an internal point of view. And I will end the talk with the idea of a logical capacity, Vernunft, logische Erkenntnisquelle in Frege, which I think will help us in understanding some of the issues that we still don't really have a clear answer on yet. So let me first introduce my ideas on the judgment stroke, because it's very strange that there is something like a judgment stroke in logic for us modern logicians, and it's there. And for Frege, he seems to introduce something of himself, that he's making the judgment there. So let us look whether this would imply a form of subjectivism or psychologism. The judgment stroke in Frege's ideography precedes all axioms and theorems, and it's a sign that these are judged as an acknowledgement of their truths. And in 1915, Frege even says that it contains the essence of logic, in the sense that the judgment stroke is a sign of judgmental force or assertive force. So understanding the judgment stroke, that might help us in understanding the relation between judgment, truth, and logic in Frege's writings. Now, doesn't the presence of the judgment stroke make Frege's logic psychologistic, as Jourdain and Wittgenstein thought? Frege's answer to this question that Jourdain has raised, whether you now regard assertion as merely psychological, is, I quote, "Judging, acknowledging as true, is certainly in our mental process. But that something is true is independent of the known agent, is objective. If one were to delete the judgment stroke from the premise sentences in the presentation of an inference and schluss in my ideography, something essential would be missing. So the judgment stroke is not to be understood as describing Frege's mental process of judging that so and so. But then what is it a sign? Frege says, with this judgment stroke I close a sentence, and the content of the sentence thus closed I assert as being true by the same sign. Now Wittgenstein seems to be right. To quote the Tractatus, Frege's judgment stroke, the Russellian assertion sign, is logically altogether meaningless. It only indicates that these authors hold as true the propositions marked in this way. So Frege, in his answer to Jourdain, says, if I assert something as true, I do not want to speak about myself, about the process in my mind, and in order to understand it, one need not know who asserted it. So the idea that was in a published paper I defended was that the judgment stroke is a sign used by a judging agent, a first person, a logical agent, and that is not to be understood as an empirical subject. So to make that point a bit more clear, there is in Frege a logical difference between two ideas of judgment. You can represent an empirical psychological phenomenon of A's judging P, GAP, where G is a two-place predicate. And if one follows Russell in this analysis of Othello's judgment, it's clearly an empirical phenomenon. For Othello's judgment that Desdemona loves Cassio, here the judgment as a predicate is there, the G, and then you get the different names for the different elements of the judgment. So Russell's analysis, and also Frege in the second half of Übersetzung Bedeutung, gives an analysis of judgment not from an internal point of view, but from an external third-person point of view. It's somebody else's judgment that I'm analyzing. And then, of course, it comes becomes part of the content. But when Frege uses the judgment stroke as a sign to indicate that he himself has judged that so and so is true, here you can fully understand the judgment without knowing who made the judgment. No name for the judging agent is needed, and we did need a name for the judging agent in the case of Russell, and where you have O as an individual constant for Othello. So the idea of judgment that's present in the judgment stroke, that's given from a non-empirical internal logical point of view. The judgment stroke can only be used by first person. The judgment sign, Frege says, is of its own special kind. It's not a semantic sign expressing the content. It does not describe anything. So fully understanding an occurrence of S preceded by the assertion sign in the Begriffsschrift is not understanding that Frege has made the judgment. One has to make the judgment for oneself. Each judging agent has to go through all the steps in the ideography. It can only work for him as a first person. Only after thought has been acknowledged by me as true, Frege writes, can it be premised for me. And you are not entitled to use the logical laws, as we find them in the Begriffsschrift, if you are not entitled to judge them yourself. In this sense, the ideography demands a first-person engagement. There seems to be a kind of agreement with what Dirk Greimann is saying, and I think there is, although maybe he wouldn't formulate in terms of the first person, and there I think is also a difference. For Greimann, the judgment stroke is not to be understood as a sign for a propositional attitude. Yes, I agree, for such attitudes are not relevant to logic. Sometimes he says the judgment stroke is a device for attributing truths of judgmental contents. That might be misleading. We do not predicate truths of a content in a judgment, because then we would move to the content. Judging is not a form of attributing truths to judgeable contents. So die Wahrheit aussagen, as Frege uses in a certain manuscript, is not so much to be translated as attributing truths, but rather, as Greimann himself says in 2014, to quote Frege in the translation by Greimann, which is the good translation, it is by using the form of the assertoric sentence that we express truths. So it's not attributing truths, it's something else. And what also a good point in Greimann is that he says the judgment stroke constitutes the truth-claiming aspect. But truth claims involve the first person. Would Greimann acknowledge a role for the first person, or is it on his account only truth that is relevant when the judgment stroke is there? I would say a first person's act of judgment indicated by the judgment stroke allows Frege for the possibility of error. One might have to withdraw the judgment stroke from the Begriffsschrift as presented, as Frege himself did in the afterword of the Grundgesetz. The point is, of course, that judgment is not an ideal notion. It is done by first persons, fallible in that sense. Taking the first person serious in the Begriffsschrift means that in logic we have essentially an internal point of view. And when I read Greimann, it seems that there we might differ. But we hear that when Greimann is answering my talk. So if we look at the notion of judgment, can we say a little bit more about it? Frege certainly says something. He gives a metaphor. Urteilen kann als Fortschreiten von einem Gedanken zu seinem Wahrheitswerte gefasst werden. By judging, we make the step from a thought to its truth value, that is, from Sinn to Bedeutung, from sense to Bedeutung, whatever that is. It's a metaphor. It's helpful to understand that the judgment stroke indicates that Frege is not an inhoudslogiker, not a content logician, not an intentional logician, but presents a Logik der Bedeutung, Logic of extension, we would think now, but there is a warning that bedeutung and extension are different notions, because Carnap's, the traditional notion of extension, and Carnap's notion of extension are actually quite different from Frege's notion of bedeutung. But it's the same direction. The context makes clear that Frege is mainly talking about judgment as erkennt, is the context of this quote. But as a general metaphor for judgment, it contains a problem. In judgment, we may be mistaken, and then there is no step from a thought to its truth value. We aim at such a step, but what we do is we claim the thought to be true. We do relate the level of sense to that of bedeutung, but the thought may actually have the false as its bedeutung. And the metaphor there does not capture the possibility of error in our judgment, and that's something to keep in mind when we talk about the first person. So, the second part, Frege's conception of logic as it's related to the logicist thesis. It's important to understand that Frege's logicist project, in which he tries to see whether we can reduce arithmetic to logic, that is really an epistemic project. His question in the preface of the Grundgesetze is, what is the epistemic nature of the arithmetical laws? What is the epistemic nature of the basic laws and of the inference rules by means of which arithmetic can be demonstrated? Do we need to invoke spatial intuition as in geometry? Or is it by purely logical means that these laws can be demonstrated? Now, if we start with the famous idea of Gottlob and Ricketts, Frege's Universalist conception of logic, I think I agree with them, but I have to tell you something more about it. So yes, the logical laws apply to all objects, all functions. Logic is thus the most universal science. But why are the logical laws universally applicable? The logical laws, Frege writes, are the laws on which all knowledge is founded, on which all sciences rest. These laws lie on a deeper level than the laws of physics. Logic is not simply more generally applicable than physics. Logic is itself a science and is the science of all sciences. So how can we understand this deeper level? For Frege, logic aims at the laws of truth. If we look at the Grundlage, the earlier text, the logical laws are for him the laws of judgment. And then 10 years later in the Grundgesetze he says the logical laws are the laws of truth. Well, are these two positions incompatible? Can we reconcile these two claims? Frege defended both theses on one page in a logic manuscript. So for him, they don't seem to be incompatible. The logical laws are the laws of truth, and thereby they are the laws of our entitlement to judge or assert. If you understand judgment not as an empirical notion, but as a normative one, the laws of truth are the laws of judgment. So can we then say a little bit more about the idea that logic lies on a deeper level? Well, certainly in the Grundlage, this is quite clear. Grundlage is a little bit more Kantian than the Grundgesetze. Denying, Frege writes, the logical laws would make thinking impossible. Thus, the logical laws seem to form the condition for the possibility of judgment. But if you then look at the Grundgesetze, Frege clearly distances himself from Erdmann's position, a kind of neo-Kantian, but the one that gives a psychological interpretation of Kant. That Erdmann says that we are forced by our nature and external circumstances to think in accordance with the logical laws. But that would be a psychological position according to Frege. Frege then focuses on the first truths of logic, and he says, if others dare to recognize and doubt, say, the law of identity in the same breath, then it seems to me like trying to jump out of one's own skin. So that would be impossible. So why does this hold for the logical principles more so than for any other logical law, or for even for other assertions that we make? So what would be the special place of the logical principles? Well, we have to realize that within the ideography, you're only entitled to use the judgment stroke to make an assertion if you know the asserted content to be true. Now, clearly, in front of the logical axioms, the basic laws, there is the judgment stroke. So it has to be on the basis of some kind of knowledge. So what kind of knowing is involved in knowing the first principles of logic? Would an answer to this question help us in explaining why logic is universally applicable, and in what sense the logical laws lie on the deeper level? So we come now to the question how we know the first principles. A central part of Frege's logicist question is what is the nature of das Einleuchten, by which we know the first principles of arithmetic. Einleuchten is something like immediate seeing, as we will soon see. Do we know these first principles by means of space or time intuition, or do we know them by logical means, that is, by our logical capacity alone? How are we to translate das Einleuchten? The nominalized verb das refers to an action, an act of immediate seeing, which may either be a logical seeing or a seeing based on an Anschauung. And how are we to translate a judgment, the truth of a thought being, unmittelbar einleuchten, to the agent? If we take self-evident as a translation, which I think is a good one, well, why then does Frege not use the German equivalent, evident, which was so common at that time? Well, if we look at the term self-evident, we have to give some kind of explanation for that in order for you to understand what I will be saying. The term goes, I think, historically goes back to Aristotle, to the posterior analytics, where he says not everything can be explained, not everything can be demonstrated. A first principle has to be self-explanatory, known through itself. And then John Locke is the first philosopher who introduces the term self-evident for the first principles, the maxims. No demonstration can be given, nor is one needed. We recognize that from people from Frege or Kant, keines Beweis ist fähig, noch bedürftig, going back to Leibniz, nouveaux essais, which goes back to Locke. And why is no demonstration needed? Because, second, if the ideas, Locke says, are clearly apprehended and put together by the judging agent, the agent will be able to know the truth of these maxims. But the term self-evident is also used by Locke in a psychological sense, and that has been very influential in our modern use of it. So Locke does give a fully epistemic account of the term, as we just seen, but there is a third characteristic, a non-essential characteristic of self-evident propositions. Their being plain to see, asserted without any possibility of doubt, uncertainty, or hesitation. These maxims add no light to our understanding, bring no increase to our knowledge, they're trivial. As a result, today, the term self-evident is often understood in the sense of patently true, easy to see, which is a psychological notion. It allows for degrees, more or less easy to see. But I will not use self-evident in its psychological sense. I will use instead the first way Locke introduced it for the original epistemic notion. And I will use the term obvious for the psychological notion. But remember, Frege does not have a technical terminology. Here, it is I who am making this distinction in order to make sense of what Frege is doing. So, to give you an example, for Frege, the truth of 2 plus 3 is 5 is obvious. It is patently true. We need no time to determine its truth. No one doubts it, but he wouldn't call it self-evident, for it can be demonstrated by truths prior in the order of explanation, to together with the use of definitions. So self-evident as an epistemic notion you can only use for first principles. Well, Frege has one technical terminology, and that's when he uses selbstverständlich in his discussions with Hilbert. Asserted sentences obtained from nominal definitions, they are von selbst wahr, selbstverständlich, Frege writes in 1914. They are not axioms, for they do not amplify our knowledge. These sentences contain merely a tautology. Here, selbstverständlich does not mean self-standing, as some authors thought. In this context, the term is not to be translated as self-evident if we use that term for the epistemic notion, as when we say that the first principles are self-evident. The truth of 3 is identical with 3, or definition is tautologous, obvious, but not self-evident, as it does not have any cognitive content. So back to the idea of self-evidence in Frege. If we now look at the Tractatus, there's some severe criticism, and the Tractatus has been very influential in this. Wittgenstein writes, if from the fact that a proposition is self-evident, it does not follow that it is true, then self-evidence is no justification for our belief in its truth. But Frege would answer, self-evidence is not a criterion of truth. It involves truth. He is very much opposed to Siquart, who has been very influential in his book on logic from 1873. Siquart says, I have a criterion to distinguish knowledge from judgment that are not knowledge. And that criterion is an inner feeling of evidence. So for Siquart, evidence would be a feeling. So that would be the psychological notion. But that, of course, for Frege would never allow us an entitlement to assert something. So the other criticism that Wittgenstein gives is, it's remarkable that so exact a thinker as Frege should have appealed to the degree of self-evidence as the criterion of a logical proposition. But for Frege, epistemic self-evidence does not allow for degrees. You either see it or you don't. So I think that self-evidence in Frege is a first-person notion. And anyway, I would prefer to understand it that way. The judgment is evident to oneself. If so, one is entitled to use the judgment stroke. A psychological notion of obviousness would never entitle the agent to use the judgment stroke. And here I differ from Tyler Birch and Robert Jesson, who assume that all we can reach is psychological obviousness. And they have an external approach, because they would say that thoughts in a Platonic realm have a certain property of being self-evident. And that's not the way I look at it, because self-evidence pertains to judgment, where we relate sin and bedeuten. Now, back to self-evidence. A first truth for Frege can only be known by an act of insight, unmittelbares Einleuchten. This epistemic act gives one an entitlement to assert the basic laws. Self-evident, like demonstration, is in this sense a normative notion. But that means also that we might be mistaken. That's that first person element. That later on I might say, oh, I thought it was self-evident, and now I know better. So how does Frege himself explain that the truth of a basic law of logic is self-evident? He writes, it can be known by a judging agent purely on the basis of grasping the sense of its expression. Then you have self-evident basic law of logic. So the way he expresses it here, I didn't give the full quote, but the full quote begins with the truth of a basic law of logic is self-evident. Self-evidence does not pertain to thoughts as such, but to the truth of the thought. In case of knowledge and judgment, we need both a thing and the bedeuten. So it's not, self-evidence is not approaching of thoughts as such. Axioms that are known on the basis of spatial or time intuition are excluded by this definition, but it's also true that Frege calls these truths, the geometrical ones, the first principles there, also self-evident. So that means that we have two kinds of self-evidence. The geometrical axioms are self-evident on the basis of spatial intuition, which is for Frege, by the way, not a Kantian pure intuition. Each agent has his own individual intuition, unshown. And the first principles of logic are self-evident in the sense that the act of seeing that they are true does not invoke any intuition, but our logical capacity alone. So we need a second one. Then, if we look at the quote again, can be known purely on the basis of grasping the sense of its expression, it seems that this does not uniquely determine the logical laws. For the truth of the thought that all bachelors are married can also be known purely on the basis of grasping the sense of the expression. The primal truths are logical ones only if they are the most general principles on the universalist conception. But is this all we can say? Well, at least we can say is in the bachelor case, non-logical terms are involved. And it's also true that Frege's logicism is in need of an absolute distinction between logical and non-logical terms. So what can we say on distinguishing logical terms from other ones? So the logicist thesis demands that we can know the first principles in a special way, in the sense that the concepts involved have to be primitive, and 5, for example, in 5 plus 2 is, 3 plus 2 is 5, 5 can be defined, so a truth involving that term cannot be immediately evident. And the primitive concepts have to be purely logical. So how are we to separate the concepts like identity, negation, and implication, the logical terms, from other notions? What we could say is these notions can be apprehended by our logical capacity alone, without any need of subjective sensations or unshown. So there's a negative part. We do not need sensations. We do not need intuitions. For intuition is for Frege not something pure, it's something particular that we don't know whether others have the same intuition. So to just apprehend them by a logical capacity alone, that's something very special. Not using either of these. But what is this logical capacity? So that means that I come to my final part of our logical capacity. So what are Frege's terms? In the Grundlage, he speaks about Vernunft. So reason, you could translate it that way. And in later work, he speaks about logische Erkenntnisquelle, so logical source of knowledge. But there is not much about logical capacity in the period of the Grundgesetze, so his most famous period. And he also does not write much about it. So this part is also a part where I try to understand Frege, what his project is. Through this logical capacity, we apprehend the logical not from an external point of view, but from the inside, Frege says in the Grundlage. And he thinks that gives us a kind of, in the Grundlage probably he thinks it gives us a kind of guarantee that it's all correct. But later he realized that this does not mean that error is excluded. Why? Well, we never know whether there was just the logical capacity involved, as when we try to understand the new concepts introduced, the concept of extension of a value, and there Frege, of course, made a mistake. He thought that only his logical capacities were involved, but it turned out that more was at stake. How are we to prevent a psychological reading of the notion of logical capacity? A capacity, I think, should not be taken as primitive, because then you have soon the psychological reading. You have to explain it in terms of its actualizations, more like the Aristotelian notion of capacity. Acts. So what are these actualizations of the logical capacity? Acts of inference, acts of understanding the primitive logical terms, like negation, implication, rho quantum. So then we get a question, what is inference? And what is this understanding of these terms? So that brings me to another topic in Frege, where I think that the idea of the first person can be very helpful in order to understand Frege's conception of inference. Inference for Frege is an act of judgment. An inference is an act of judgment that is drawn according to logical laws from judgments previously made. Second, the logical inference is for Frege an epistemic notion. You first have to know the premises. Judging, insofar as one is cognizant of other truths as providing a justification for it, means inferring. So an inference is an act of judgment based on other judgments made. Inferring is a special case of judgment. Neither of these notions is to be understood in a psychological sense, as we see in my first section, where I understood judgment to be not an empirical notion, but a logical one, and inferring is a special case of that. So in what sense is inference an epistemic notion? Well, the act of inference, as an act, has to bring us from known premises to a known conclusion. What sense can we make of the idea that inference is a first-person notion? Well, for Frege, a premise has to be a premise for me, or as I sometimes say it, proof has to be a proof for me. Inferring is in this sense a first-person's act. You have to do it yourself. And furthermore, you are entitled to make the inference only if you have made the inference rule evident to yourself. So if we look at the way in the Grundgesetz Frege explains the modes of inference, the scheme, in German it says, aus den Sätzen, if delta then gamma, und delta kann geschlossen werden, delta. Well, you have to look at the picture because Satz can mean anything, but here Frege uses it as a shorthand for Begriffsschriftsatz. You can see that also in the picture because the judgment stroke precedes the sentences. So the mode of inference is explained for Begriffsschriftsatz only, including the judgment stroke. That is for assertions. So these are ideography assertions. So what you see in when you look at the way Frege explains these inference rules, that normative notions are involved. Kan, we saw on the former slide, kunnen, can. If the assertions, if delta and gamma and delta are given to us, Frege also writes, we are allowed to infer the conclusion. What can that mean, it is allowed? It means we are entitled to assert a conclusion for the premises give a justification. So he explains the inference rule in terms of entitlement. Inference schemas are thus explained in terms of permissions, entitlements, in German erlauben, dürfen, können. Is there not also then a notion of commitment there? Well, yes, there is. There is a passage in the Begriffsschrift where Frege says, implies that only when assertions are actually made, obligations, commitments, müssen, become relevant. For he says, and I quote, if the sentence, all objects have the property F is denied, then one must be able to come up with a reference for A so that FA is denied. So you have to give then a justification if somebody asks for it, and that you are committed to do that. So that's an interesting way in which you see how this is all, of course, becomes understandable if you see that the first person plays a role here. So we see now that that inference is a first person notion, special case of judgment, and the inference schemas apply to assertions only. This is also epistemic. For Frege, the inference rule brings us from known premises to a known conclusion, and this is possible only if the inference rule is evident to the judging agent. For this, of course, we need an understanding of implication. If you look at this picture, you see that in order to make it evident to yourself, you have to understand what implication means in order to make modus ponens evident to yourself. So if we now look at how we can understand implication, or in general how we can understand the primitive terms of logic, we have to make the inference rules evident to ourselves on the basis of understanding the primitive terms involved, and these terms need to be purely logical. Being primitive, no definition can be given, and each agent here has to do the work for himself on the basis of Frege's elucidations. There is thus an essential first-person element to our understanding of the terms. So this leads us to the other question: what makes the notions of implication, negation, identity, and universal quantifier logical notions? What? Well, if you look at the Begriffsschrift, Frege elucidates implication in terms of judgment. You see there bejahen, verneinen. Then this is, of course, not his final point of view. In the Grundgesetz, implication is elucidated in terms of truth scales. Can we somehow reconcile these two theses? In both elucidations, there is a central role for truth, for judgment. And we understand what truth is from understanding what judgment is, and vice versa. The primitive notions of truth and judgment are elucidated thus in terms of each other. So what we see is both kinds of exercises of our logical capacity, inference and understanding the primitive logical terms, are in fact exercises of our general capacity to judge. We can thus understand our logical capacities through understanding what judgment is. And if you would like to, I can also read a passage from a manuscript I have in which I go a little bit more into this idea of a logical capacity, but it also distracts a little bit from the main line. So I keep it just in case you would like to hear more about it. It takes about 5 or 10 minutes because it's a reading of 2 pages. So, but let's summarize. So Frege's notion of vernunft, the logical capacity. The fact that we have to invoke our logical capacity does not for Frege imply a form of subjectivism, but rather makes clear to us the centrality of judgment and reasoning in all our scientific questions. And here I would love to quote the German and then I will translate it. Denn die Frage beantworten, was die Dinge unabhängig von der Vernunft sind, hieße urteilen ohne zu urteilen, den Pellstraschen ohne ihn nass zu machen. So translate to answer the question what things are independent of reason, of our logical capacity, means judging without judging, to wash the fur without wetting it. And you see the internal connection between the logical capacity and the capacity to judge. So I think two can be identified. So if I now conclude, we now realize that our logical capacity is nothing but our capacity to judge, and that anyone who has this capacity is able to know the truths of logic and to know the primitive truths without mediation. We may see now the reason why logic lies on a deeper level than the other sciences. We know the logical laws by means of our capacity to judge as such. We cannot make sense of a denial of an acknowledged logical law, for we understand its truth to be determined by nothing but our capacity to judge, and we take it thereby to be essentially the same for any thinking agent, as it does not involve any sense perception or anscha. Thank you very much. Shall I now stop my share screening or let me see?
So thanks a lot, Maria. Now we begin the debate. And without further ado, Dirk, you can begin your debate with Maria and share your screen.
So in the first place, I would like to thank Mario very much for the invitation. Very grateful for this opportunity to discuss Maria's views on Frege with her. She has a very big name in her area of publication, which is one of which is Frege. I did receive the slides before when I prepared my objections to her views on Frege, but I did not know the final version. And in her presentation now, she anticipated some of my objections, but in the discussion, I would like nevertheless to mention them, and perhaps I could make them clearer. I'm trying to put my text onto the screen. I don't know whether my text is available to Bruno.
Yeah, Dirk, so you can click on your Word app and then your text will be on the screen. So just click on Word, right? On your computer.
I've opened my text.
Yeah, okay. Now it is on the screen for everyone.
Okay. But you can scroll the text, right?
No, you need to scroll it.
Okay.
Okay.
So I will read some of my objections and comment them still. And I would like to ask Maria first. I have basically 4 objections, whether she prefers that I present them in a block or whether we should discuss them separately.
Yeah, do it in a block.
Okay.
Yeah.
According to van der Schaar, an assertion is primarily the manifestation of an act of judgment for Frege. An assertion is the outer manifestation of the inner act of acknowledging a thought as true. This is a characterization that you will find in Dummett's work. This reading is strongly suggested by Frege's quasi-definition of assertion in The Thought and parallel writings. It gives rise to the suspicion that the introduction of the judgment stroke in Frege's system involves a psychologistic element. In modern terms, from a perspective of speech act theory, this conception of assertion assimilates the speech act of assertion to expressive speech acts. An expressive speech act does not have a direction of fit in Searle's classification. Its point is to express normally a feeling like ouch. And on this reading of Frege's conception of assertion, the difference between assertion and a merely expressive speech act like ouch is that the content is a propositional content and not an emotional one. Assertions have the direction of fit of word to world. And I think that Frege takes this into account by saying that by making a judgment or assertion, we are making the step from a thought to its truth value. So I'm not sure that we can really attribute to Frege this conception of assertion, but it is really strongly suggested by his comments on assertion in The Thought, which is the locus classicus of his conception of assertion. However, it seems that Frege has 2 different notions of assertion, which are, I think, complementary one. According to the second notion, to assert is to present a thought as true, als wahr hinstellen. Crispin Wright has commented that this is an analytic truth. To assert something means to present a thought as true. Thus, by asserting snow is white, we are claiming that it is true that snow is white. Frege writes, and Maria quoted this as well, it is really by using the form of the assertoric sentence that we express truth, womit wir Wahrheit aussagen. And to do this, we do not need the word true. Indeed, we can say that even where we use the locution, it is true that, the essential thing is really the form of the assertoric sentence. What Frege calls here the form of the assertoric sentence is the sentence mood. You have different types of sentences in natural language, like questions, like imperative sentence, like assertoric sentence. And the assertoric sentences are not marked by a special sign, but by syntactical and phonological markers. And to put something forward as true, we only need to assert this thing, this thought. This is, I think, Frege's basic insight. We do not need neither the truth operator, it is true that, nor the truth predicate, X is true, to put something forward as true, but only assert this content. The judgment stroke is the formal counterpart to the form of the assertoric sentence in natural language. It must hence be considered as a kind of pragmatic truth operator. In Frege's first system, it expresses that a content is a fact. Frege says this explicitly. The logical form of snow is white is the whiteness of snow is a fact, where is a fact is to be understood as an illocutionary act indicating device, by means of which the speaker presents the whiteness of snow as a fact. This is a kind of pseudo predicate. Frege says this almost explicitly, is a fact in the formal language, or the judgment stroke has a pragmatic function. But the pragmatic function of asserting something as true. To assert is to assert something as true, just as to judge is to judge something as true. So truth is the measure of judgment and the measure of assertion. In Frege's second system, the judgment stroke expresses the identity of a truth value with the true. The logical form of snow is white is the truth value of that snow is white is the true. This revision is made by Frege because of his distinction between sense and reference. He wants to separate the mere expression of a thought from the assertion of its truth, and the nominalization, the truth value of that snow is white, is a singular term referring to a truth value whose sense is a mode of presentation. And this mode of presentation is simultaneously a thought. The sense of this name of a truth value expresses a thought, but without presenting this thought as being true. So on my reading, at least in Frege's major system, every sentence has the logical form of an identity sentence. We are always identifying one truth value with the true. Thus, in Funktion and Begriff, he explains the task of the judgment stroke as follows. If we write down an equation or inequality, for instance, 5 is greater than 5, we ordinarily wish at the same time to express a judgment. In our example, we want to assert that 5 is greater than 4. According to the view I am here presenting, that is the conception of predicates as functional signs, 5 is greater than 4 and 1 plus 3 equals 5 just give us expressions for truth values without making any assertions. That means 5 is greater than 4 has to be read as the truth value of that 5 is greater than 4. We thus need a special sign in order to be able to assert something. To this end, I make use of a vertical stroke at the end of the horizontal, so that, for example, by writing judgment stroke horizontal 2 plus 3 equals 5, we assert that 2 plus 3 equals 5. Thus here we are not just writing down a truth value, as in 2 plus 3 equals 5, but also at the same time saying that it is the true. And in Grundgesetze, Frege says similar things. By identifying this truth value with the true, we are subsuming objects under concepts and relations. Frege considers concepts and relations as characteristic functions whose value is always a truth value. And in a judgment, we specify what truth value is the result of applying these functions to objects. So when we judge or assert that that snow is white, for instance, we are not attributing truth considered as a property to a thought, but we are evaluating the value of characteristic functions for objects, and the effect of this is that we are subsuming objects under concepts and relations. The sentence "snow is white" does not speak about thought and predicates of it that it is true, but it speaks about snow and predicates of it that it is white. And Maria has made in her task a similar point, so there is complete agreement here, I think. Nevertheless, my first objection is that, according to Frege's own elucidations, the judgment stroke expresses in the first place that the content is true, and not that it is taken to be true, as van der Schaar assumes. I think it is for this reason that Frege considers the judgment stroke as a logical operator and not as a psychological one. An assertoric sentence claims that its content is true and not that its content is taken to be true. To understand the sentence, we must hence not know who the speaker is. This is the main point in Frege's answer to Jourdain. I think that the insight behind Frege's introduction of the judgment stroke into logic is that a theory consists not of a set of propositions, but of a set of assertions. A theory asserts thoughts. A mere list of propositions does not assert anything. And it would even be correct to say that a theory asserts something. For instance, Frege's theory asserts that there are value ranges. It does not concern us who is the subject of assertion. We can abstract away from this question. So we have an impersonal subject here. I agree with this in this respect with Maria. I found in Maria's work 3 interpretations of the judgment stroke. The first is she also reads, like me, the judgment stroke as a kind of truth operator. It claims that the content of the expression to which it is applied is true. But second, she assumes that it also expresses that the speaker judges something as true. This is the expressive speech act of expressing judgment. In my own view, this is an infelicious formulation of Frege's view, which is corrected by him in his answer to Jourdain. To assert for Frege is basically to present something as true. What are we doing when we are making an assertion? We are doing several things. We present something as true, Or in other words, we are committing ourselves to the truth of the thought expressed. This is the aspect of a truth operator. But we are also expressing a belief. In fact, so the two characterizations we find in Frege of assertion are complementary. But the sense of assertion that is relevant to logic is the truth-claiming aspect. The expressive aspect, I think, is irrelevant. So Wittgenstein's objection to Frege is based on a misunderstanding of Frege's concept of assertion and of the task of the judgment stroke. It is not to be understood as a psychological operator indicating propositional attitudes or acts of judging, but it is basically a truth operator, a pragmatic truth operator. I would like to call this the logical notion of assertion, to present something as true. This is my first objection. So I shall go on to the second, which is not very much to the point, because I thought that Maria will make the same point she made in her paper, her very nice paper, published in Mind, on Frege's logic and the first-person perspective, which refers to Moore's paradox. Van der Schaar explains the first-person perspective involved in Frege's notion of judgment by means of Moore's paradox. I do not explain here what Moore's paradox is. I assume that this is well known. A judgment agent cannot judge a thought as true and simultaneously assume that this thought is not true. From a first-person perspective, to acknowledge a thought as true and to be true are one and the same thing. However, it seems to be misleading to speak of a first-person perspective in this context. To investigate the North Sea from the first-person perspective means to investigate this object by investigating our mental representations of it. Frege mentions this case in the Foundations in paragraph 26. On my understanding, the first-person perspective is characterized by introspection. What Maria has in mind is something different, of course, but I do not understand completely what this is, the first-person perspective. Frege rejects this approach to investigate the North Sea by investigating our mental representations of it, because it turns physics into psychology. He would certainly reject the first-person perspective in logic as well. For me, it comes as a surprise to put the first-person perspective into Frege's logic, because his approach, his overall approach, is anti-psychologistic, and the first-person perspective doesn't fit well with his overall approach. But Maria is much more subtle with her distinctions. So what exactly is this first-person perspective? I'll come back to it. It is a linguistic convention that by asserting a thought, the speaker commits himself to the truth of this thought. This already explains why the judging agent cannot affirm that a thought judged by him as true is actually false. The first-person perspective is not needed. I only want to make sure that I'm still on the screen right, so the transmission works. Van der Schaar explains the first-person perspective involved by the judgment stroke more closely as follows. By putting the judgment stroke in front of an axiom, the agent claims not only that the thought is true, but that anyone who understands the thought thereby acknowledges it as true, and is thus entitled to use it as an axiom. By putting the judgment stroke in front of a theorem, the agent claims that anyone who knows the axiom and has made the relevant inference rules evident to himself or herself is entitled to use the theorem as a logical law. These judgments are thus made from a first-person perspective, but they are not non-personal at the same time. This is the third reading of the judgment stroke that I identify in Maria's work. The first is the judgment stroke as a kind of truth operator. The second as a kind of expressive device. And the third reading is that the judgment stroke is equivalent to the expression axiom and theorem in modern mathematical textbooks. Right? In mathematical textbooks, you put in front of an assertion axiom or theorem. Axiom and theorem indicate the logical status of an assertion in the theory. Axiom means this assertion cannot be proved. It is a fundamental assertion which cannot be derived from other assertions. And in the case of Frege, it is self-evident. So by putting the judgment stroke in front of a sentence, we are claiming that the thought expressed has certain epistemic properties. It cannot be proved from more fundamental thoughts, and it has a kind of self-evidence. I cannot see a basis in Frege's text for this reading, but I think it's a very interesting reading, but which assimilates the judgment stroke to the use of the words axiom and theory in modern mathematics. I'm not sure that this is right. On this reading, by putting the judgment stroke in front of a sentence, the speaker claims that she is able to demonstrate the truth of the thought expressed. As far as I can see, this reading has no basis in Frege's text. On the contrary, in the thought and related writings, Frege acknowledges that in science we must often make assertions without being able to demonstrate that they are true. Thus, the tree in front of me might not really exist. Its existence might be an optical illusion. Nevertheless, in normal situations, I'm entitled to affirm that there is a tree in front of me. In science, we must run the risk of making assertions that we cannot completely justify. I have the impression that Maria attributes to Frege the conception of assertion promoted by Timothy Williamson, according to which the main norm of assertion is that you are entitled to assert that P only if you know that P. But I think that Frege's discussion of scepticism in the thought makes it clear that he does not accept this norm. In physics, we run the risk of error. We do not know whether our existential presuppositions are true. Nevertheless, we are entitled to make assertions whose truth depends on these existential presuppositions, and we have the same situation in mathematics. We cannot prove that there are value ranges. Nevertheless, we are condemned to assume that they exist. If we want to do mathematics, we must assume that they exist. But we cannot prove, we do not know whether they really exist. So I'm inclined to say that Frege does not accept this norm. Third objection. Van der Schaar assumes that Frege's justification of the axioms of his system also involves a first-person perspective. His justification of axiom 1, however, is equivalent to a modern correctness proof of the rule of conditionalization. The axiom reads, if P, then if Q, then P. It is proved by Frege as follows. Assume that the axiom is false. In this case, P is true, and if Q, then P is false. But if Q, then P is false only if P is false. Since P cannot be both true and false, the axiom cannot be false, hence it is true. Frege gives a similar justification for modus ponens. It also has the form of a modern correctness proof. The first-person perspective is not involved. Perhaps Maria will reject this reading because she assumes that Frege does not have a metalinguistic perspective, but this is controversial, and I think it is very natural to read Frege's justification of axiom 1 and of modus ponens as modern correctness proofs. The kind of evidence Frege provides for the justification of the basic laws of logic is semantic evidence. Thus, he shows that the semantic interpretation of the conditional stroke already guarantees that modus ponens is truth-preserving. This kind of evidence does not seem to depend somehow on a first-person perspective, as Van der Schaar claims, in the sense of it is evident for me. To be sure, from Frege's point of view, the correctness proofs are circular, because they already presuppose the validity of the logical laws. To prove the correctness of modus ponens, we must use modus ponens or similar laws. The basic laws of logic can hence not be properly proved. They cannot be justified in any non-circular way. As Frege puts it, as to the question why and with what right we acknowledge a logical law to be true, logic can respond only by reducing it to other logical laws. Where this is not possible, it can give no answer. So I have a slightly different reading of this citation. I think it shows that Frege says that we must accept some justificationary gaps. We are simply not able to justify in a non-circular way the laws of logic. There is simply no non-circular justification. Whereas Maria seems to assume that Frege does give a justification. In my view, Frege gives a justification, but it presupposes what it is designed to show, the validity of the logical laws. But considering that the justification makes use of the logical laws, they are circular. Fourth, and this is my final point, Frege does not justify axiom 5 in the way indicated by Van der Schaar. He does not derive its truth from an analysis of its meaning. Rather, his justification is similar to Quine's indispensability argument for the existence of abstract objects. The problem with axiom 5 is that it implicitly postulates the existence of value ranges. This postulate is justified by Frege as follows. It has thus become plausible that creating proper is not available to the mathematician, or at least that it is tied to conditions that make it worthless. Against this, it could be pointed out that in the first volume, we ourselves created new objects, namely value ranges. What did we in fact do there? Or to begin with, what did we not do? We did not list properties and then say we create a thing that has these properties. Rather, we said if one function and a second function are so constituted that both always have the same value for the same argument, then we say instead the value range of the first function is the same as the value range of the second. We then recognize something in common. I take this to be we ontological recognize something in common to both functions, and this we will call the value range both of the first function and of the second function. That we have the right so to acknowledge what is common, and that accordingly we can convert the generality of an equality into an equality identity, must be regarded as a basic law of logic. The problem is that axiom 5 contains existence postulate, and the existence of objects cannot be demonstrated by an analysis of meaning. It is not analytic. Existing claims are not analytic in Kant's sense. Anachronistically speaking, Frege claims here that axiom 5 does not really create the value causes. Rather, it makes the ontological commitments of mathematics explicit. In Frege's words, it is certainly clear that the mentioned possibility of conversion has, in fact, always been made use of. It is just that the coinciding is predicated of the functions themselves, rather than of the value causes. We are thus not doing anything new by means of this conversion, but we do it in full awareness and by appealing to a basic law of logic. This is a kind of transcendental justification. It is a condition of the possibility of logic that there are value causes, but it is not a kind of justification that are mentioned by Maria. Thus, Frege affirms axiom 5, although he cannot prove that value ranges really exist. Hence, we cannot ascribe to him the view that we are entitled to make an assertion in a system only if we are able to prove it in a satisfactory way. I'm not sure that my objections are really fair. They are a bit external. I did not know the final version of the text you presented today, Maria, but I did my best to create a basis for our discussion.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you. Can I already start? Everything works?
Yes, you can, Maria.
Hello. Okay, can I just start? Okay. So I think to get a little bit of focus, to start with the last point, I think that was very convincing. So I don't think I have to say a lot about that. I think that was a very good point. Yeah. So, but that means that I would have some more time to address objection 1, 2, and 3. Regarding the first objection, if I don't know, maybe I implied it somehow, but I didn't intend to say that according to Frege, when you use the judgment stroke, that you express something about yourself. I don't think so. It's more that by using the judgment stroke, you make the judgment, you assert something. So also to say that the judgment stroke expresses something, that is already on Frege's account, that would be something like that it would have a meaning, but of course it doesn't. Of course you say, well, then it's in philosophy of language it means something else, but it doesn't seem. If I would have some formulation that goes in that direction, I would really like to withdraw that, because that was not my intention. It's also not what Frege himself says, because he says, when I use the judgment stroke, it's a sign that I make the judgment, that I make the assertion. So of course that means that he has then the judgment, but that's not what this is sign of. Shall I go on then with the second one? Maybe you noticed that I now in the talk and in the manuscript that I more recently written, I do still use the concept of first person, but I see that first person perspective might be a bit misleading, because that sounds as though everyone has his own first person perspective. And that was precisely not my intention. The idea was that of the first person is that anyone as a first person can engage in the same thing. So it's when it was related to Moore's paradox, it was done in a way where you see Moore uses the I in it's raining, but I don't believe it is. There, the I is essential, and it's crucial. That role of the I, that was the role of the first person I mentioned. So the idea of the first person, it's not something personal, because otherwise, of course, you would be right that it would be completely against Frege's idea of logic as anti-psychologistic. So I try to develop a concept of subject, if you want, of the first person, which is not infected by psychology. So there are things we do, but as soon as we describe them from the outside, it is, of course, you describe something psychological. But the way we do it as a first person is something else. So that's why I was kind of forced to say, if it's not an empirical ego, what can it be but a transcendental ego? And regarding the third point, I think there is indeed an important difference between us, and let's see how far we can get closer to each other. But it's also related to the fact that I have this consistently internal point of view that I think Frege shares. Is first you were talking about the Timothy Williamson norm of assertion, that is knowledge. It is true that in a certain sense I think that Frege does think that, but not so. When he uses the judgment stroke in front of an axiom, and it turns out to be wrong, he has to withdraw the assertion. Does he then know it? Well, he would be fully entitled if he would know it. That I think he would make. But what does knowledge then mean for Frege? It means having rechtfertigungsgründe. So it means having a justification. And that justification, of course, it can later, or the self-evidence, which works the same, it can later turn out to be not self-evident, not to be a justification. But it's all I can have now, and that's what is part of science, that the assertions we make, we claim to know them, and they pass as knowledge until somebody else comes and gives refutation or even shows a contradiction. So this whole idea of a risk of error is, in my case, essentially part of the idea that first person plays a role, and that we need a judgment stroke. Because precisely because you have a judgment stroke, and Frege says, I hereby assert, then you realize, okay, it's on the basis of something epistemic, you have rechtfertigungsgründe, or it's einleuchtend, but of course, yeah, we do make mistakes. And what was also part of that criticism, my answer to that would be, you were saying that, okay, it's kind of meta-linguistic approach, but the whole point is that in order to start reading the Begriffsschrift as a reader, you have to understand implication, and that is what the work that is done there. In the page, I have some pages, 5 or 10 minutes, if people want that. I could read that at the end, but let's wait for that, because it's so nice to have a discussion, and then to read again, that would be a bit of a pity, but it would contain some of Some of the elements I said about Vernunft, logical capacity, relate to this first person element and how far this is not to be understood in any psychological sense. Although, of course, it is subject related. So these 3 points, they seem to be somehow connected, because it all turns on the question, yeah, what do you mean then by first person? And can that really help us to understand Frege's project? Because that's the issue today. So let me stop for now. I can say more if you want to, but let's see what the reactions are. Yeah?
Okay, thank you very much. And now, Maria, my reading, or the reading I attributed to you, I took from the published paper, Frege on Judgment and the Judging Agent.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that the pagination is right, because
Doesn't matter. I don't have it here.
it's on page 19
Yeah.
of the pirate version.
Oh, yeah, I see.
I don't have access to the original paper. It is a pre-published version.
Oh.
And
it's open access, by the way.
Então the pagination is right. Então it's on page 19.
Okay. Yeah.
You're right. And I think that's really essential for your account of the judgment sign. The judgment sign is a sign that the content is acknowledged to be true. And then you make clear that this is not to be understood in a psychological way. If I say judgment stroke, snow is white, this cannot be paraphrased as Dirk Greimann is a psychological fact. Dirk Greimann acknowledges as true that snow is white. You reject this psychological reading, but you agree with Wittgenstein that the judgment stroke, I say, expresses the acknowledgement of something as true. You say is a sign of. I think there is a formulation problem. Perhaps it is not correct of me to say that it is to say that you think that the judgment stroke expresses anything, but it is a sign of acknowledging something to be true. So I got the impression that you agree with Wittgenstein that for Frege to assert something is to manifest in an empirical way, is to manifest the inner act of acknowledging something as true. Dammit calls this the outer manifestation of the inner act of judging, of the inner. You have a mental act. Frege admits it's a mental act, the mental act of acknowledging a thought as true. And what is assertion? For Frege, the characterization in thought suggests that assertion is only the outer manifestation of this inner act. It is for this reason that I said that on this approach, a Fregean assertion is an expressive speech act. Its task is to make visible what is happening in my mind. And I thought, but I may be mistaken, that you share this interpretation because you write explicitly the judgment sign is a sign that the content is acknowledged to be true. So perhaps you can say a little more about this. Then you have a second interpretation. At the same time, within the ideography, one is entitled to make the judgment only if one knows that the concept is true. And you say at another places that this is also expressed by the judgment stroke or indicated by the judgment stroke.
Yeah.
Or that it is claimed when you put the judgment stroke in front of a sentence or of a singular term referring to a truth value, then you are claiming that this content is self-evident. That is, you are claiming that you are making some epistemic claims. You do not only say if P, then if Q, then P, but you are also claiming, and this is self-evident. You're making two claims in a certain sense. For me, that's a problem because I can say that by making an assertion, you make a logical assertion and additionally also an epistemic one. And at other places, you also say that by putting the judgment stroke in front of a sentence, you are claiming that it is true. That is my reading, right? This is a completely impersonal function of the judgment stroke. It's a kind of truth claiming device, which corresponds to the form of the assertoric sentence. To understand what the form of snow is white means, you do not need to know who uttered the sentence. You know it expresses truth.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that makes it more clear. So what you don't want is that the judgment stroke is a kind of sign that expresses something, that a content is true, because then you would turn it into a content, and that's not what you want. So the sign, and you're absolutely right, is and that you might say our other formulations I gave is a pragmatic sign. It's a sign of a truth claim. But still, to refer the whole topic to the first person, by making a truth claim, I do that as there's somebody who's making the truth claim. There is a first person involved. And when I address these epistemic issues and I say, well, I'm only entitled to make the assertion within the ideography when I know it, it is also something that I have to know as a first person. There's something about me, the I, that in order to be entitled this, that I have to know it. So by bringing in that element besides the truth claiming aspect, it becomes thereby more clear, more visible that there is this first person element involved. You see why, that's the reason why I stress that more than you do because if you say it's just truth claiming, yeah, but that's true, but there is a scientist involved there. It's not something ideal, like say that there are thoughts and their bedeutung is true. No, somebody has to say that the thought is true, and that's precisely brings in this fallibility that you need, and that I express by saying that there's this role for the first person by introducing the judgment stroke in Frege's logic. So yeah, of course you can read it in the other way, the passages. I heard that when you read them, but they were meant to be not to be read as signs expressing something, as having certain content, as expressing that there is something happening in the speaker, because that would indeed make it subjectivistic and psychologistic. You are absolutely right in that point. Thank you.
Okay. I think we agree with regard to Frege's notion of judgment. Let me explain my understanding of this notion. I think there is a paradigmatic case which Frege uses to explain what he understands by judging. It is the situation where the scientist puts up a certain hypothesis, say neutrinos do not have mass, neutrinos lack mass. This might be a hypothesis. At this stage of the investigation, the scientist still leaves open whether this is the case or not the case, right? The scientist leaves open whether the hypothesis is true or false. It is a mere hypothesis. Now he gathers some evidence in order to decide whether the hypothesis is true or false, and at the end of the investigations will make a judgment. And the act of judgment is characterized by the fact that it turns a hypothesis into a belief. To believe means to take something to be true. Judgment and holding something to be true are different things. To hold something true is a propositional attitude, and to judge is an act. But judging is the act of turning a mere hypothesis into a belief. This is my understanding of Frege. It leaves open whether the hypothesis is true or false. You can also, as yourself say, you can be mistaken. You can take a thought to be true, which actually is false, right? But now you say that from a first-person perspective, this is impossible. Is this right? As a thinker, as a judging agent, you cannot judge that P and at the same time question that P.
Yeah.
And I think this is the key to understand your notion of first-person perspective. You have a special case when you judge a content, because in this case you cannot question whether what you are judging as true is really true. For this reason, you say that from the first-person perspective, to be true and to be acknowledged as true is the same. And the point is that you can, with regard to other persons, you can always make this distinction. The person X acknowledges as true the thought T, but T is not true. There is no conflict between these two assumptions. X acknowledges as true the thought T, but T is not true. Now you can't make the two assumptions in your own case. You acknowledge as true that P, but it is not true that P. And my question is this the essence of the first-person perspective? That, because this would be similar to Moore's paradox. You can always say it is X believes that snow is white, but snow is not white, etc. But you can say the same thing in your own case. Yeah. This is a basic idea.
That is the idea. That's right. So the first person can only leave his own position and no longer use the I in order to say, yes, I judge that, but it's not the case. But if he as a first person, you make that judgment, and that's it. There's no way to step outside of it. So it is this consistently internal point of view, which I think is in Frege, and it's also the way he builds up his logic and the way the axioms and inference rules are justified. So that has quite some consequences also. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It also explains that there are moments when he says, also in the Grundgesetz, in the preface, I can't at the same time acknowledge a truth like the law of identity and deny it, or even consider the possibility of denying it. how could I do that if I have acknowledged? And especially with logic, that counts even more than with physical science, because in logic I have determined the truth by my logical capacity alone. And that doesn't mean that there is this general idea that I might be mistaken and the issue of error. But that's when I just look at I look at my past judgments and know that I've been mistaken in the past. I take up an external point of view. But I don't have that as a scientist. I'm in the science, doing the science. And this is justification I have, and this is what I have to assert. So there's nothing like relativity going on there.
I understand. Let me finally make a question with regard to the madman example.
Exactly.
You are alluding to the madman.
Yeah, because I know you've written about it, and it was different. It was that we had the same criticism on Taschek, but we choose different paths to answer it. So please go.
In your published paper, if I remember that correctly, you say that the recognition of the logical laws is not constitutive for judging because the madman does judge.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But in the new paper,
yeah,
you say the opposite. You say that the recognition of the logical laws is constitutive for judging. What is your final position?
Well, the point is I still endorse the way I read it in the first paper. So yes, these laws are descriptive. I have all the arguments against Taschek there, but as soon as I've acknowledged something to be a logical law, I myself as a first person cannot but understand this as constitutive for judgment, because I know I've only used my logical capacity. I know this is the same for everyone. So how could somebody not judge that? But that doesn't mean that if you take an external point of view and look at it that way, that there would be still a madman, and that madman, of course, would still be making, not from, as a first person, I cannot understand this as a judgment. I cannot make sense of it. But as soon as I have acknowledged it, I cannot make sense of anything else. But that doesn't mean that there couldn't be persons who have somehow different logical laws. It's just that I cannot make sense of it. So it's not constitutive. It's not a transcendental argument in Kant's sense, because for Kant there is not something, the first person as a transcendental ego is not fallible. But in Frege he is. So that means that there are moments, maybe not regarding the law of excluded middle, but regarding other logical axioms, where we still might be mistaken. So I think Taschek had a point. So in a certain sense, that manuscript paper is a kind of answer to Taschek, and also showing, well, but it's different from Kant, but because of this important concept of self-evidence that plays a role there, and that's precisely why it makes the whole story fallible, and not as absolute as we have it in Kant.
Okay. I thank you very much for this discussion. Many points have become clearer for me. I'm really satisfied. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dirk. Yeah, thank you. It was great. Thank you very much, Dirk, for all your work and interesting comments and stimulating questions. That's absolutely
my pleasure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I would like, in name of our research group on the origins of contemporary philosophy, to thank you both for accepting our invitation for the participation on this event. I would like to thank Maria for the great presentation, and thank you both for the great debate. I would like to also thank you all for joining us today. Tomorrow we'll begin at the same time, so 9 a.m. Brazilian time, so UTC -3. And we'll have the honor to have as our guest Delphine Antoine Mahou, who is professor at École Normale Supérieure de Lyon, and which will debate her presentation with Federico Boccacini, who is professor at Universidade de Brasília. For further information on the event and on our research group, which promotes many other events also, you can access our website, our Instagram, and our Facebook, which is here down below. And I hope we can see all each other tomorrow. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.